In my online course called Analysis for Composers, lesson number 28 was about the differences between what is salient to our eyes when we look at a score, what we notice with our ears when listening to the same piece. My point was that sometimes analysis focuses on connections we see but that are very hard to hear. Here I want to talk about salience from the point of view of the composer. In general, if you want your piece to have maximum impact on the listener, you have to know what will stand out. If you focus too much attention on things that most people will never notice, the result will have no expressive force. And since, as we shall see, there are many degrees of salience, these decisions are not always simple. But realistic ear training helps a lot. By realistic ear training, I don't mean the standard ear training classes, but rather continuous observation as to what you yourself notice first in various musical situations. First thing to understand about salience is that it's very context dependent. What sticks out in one situation might be totally unnoticeable in another. Here's an example. Here the chromatic major seventh in the fourth bar sounds like a mistake. Why? Well, first it suddenly changes register for no reason. Also, the other intervals preceding and following it are all consonant and diatonic. So when that chromatic major seventh does arrive, it sticks out a lot. And it is not at a cadence or a prepared peak, so nothing in the overall context makes this moment a logical place to highlight. Now here's the same major seventh in another context. The overall context here is much more chromatic and dissonant, and the major seventh, the strongest dissonance in the phrase, arrives accented at the end of the phrase. Since that is also the peak of the phrase, and since the previous high notes were E and F, the dissonance feels like part of a progression prepared. The context justifies it. As an example from the musical repertoire, a chromatic modulation in Wagner's Tristan will stand out less than in, say, a Mozart symphony, since the overall language of Tristan is much more chromatic than in the Mozart. We know that evolution has made humans very sensitive to our environment, in particular to what's normal and what's unusual in a given context. If you're walking in a park on a nice day with a friend, you will notice a bear growling more than a bird chirping, since usually birds are everywhere in that environment, whereas you don't expect a bear in your average park. And a bear is generally more dangerous than a bird. In music, a listener very quickly draws conclusions about what's normal in a given style, usually within a few seconds, and from then on, salience will be in relation to that norm. Another example. Let's look at this Neapolitan chord in Chopin's Prelude, Opus 28, number 20 for piano. The D-flat major chord in measure 8 and in measure 12 is here a way to highlight and intensify the cadence. Note that this chord has already appeared in measure 2, but there the local context is A-flat major, so it doesn't stick out as much. Notice also that the upper line reaches a low point in measures 8 and 12, again underlining the conditional moment. Chopin very early on establishes what's normal in this piece with several secondary dominants in measure 2, 3, and 4. The Neapolitan chord is a bit more dramatic, appropriate for where it occurs, but still very clearly part of the same harmonic world. Context very quickly establishes what's normal here, and everything that follows is sort of in the light of these norms. As we can see here, there are degrees of salience. The little tonicizations in measure 2 and 3 are salient also, not quite as much as the Neapolitan chord when it arrives. Also, the previous chromatic chords create a kind of progression of harmonic intensity, so that when the Neapolitan chord does finally arrive, it's a culmination. By changing the preceding context, Chopin could have made that chord less or more salient. If it were the only chromatic chord in the piece, it would have stuck out more. Or imagine if the only chord played, for example, by brass instruments, it would sound like a mistake. On the other side, if the overall context were more chromatic, it would just go unnoticed. A big part of the composer's job is to create special moments in sound, so fine control of salience is a very powerful tool. The critical point here is that the aspiring composer must learn to be realistic as to what will stand out in a given context, and how to increase or decrease salience as required. For example, one could make something more salient by preceding it with a sudden pause, or an upbeat rhythm, or a clear progression in some dimension of the music leading to the event we want to underline. Or we can make it less salient by making it more like its surroundings. As a rule, an important musical event should sound prepared in its context, not arbitrary. If we think of what aspects of music are most evident at first hearing, pitch is only one of several important dimensions. Changes of timbre, tempo, articulation, and register tend to stand out a lot. Of course, motives and harmony are important, but unless the changes are quite drastic, they won't be noticed as easily as these other aspects of the music. There are some compositional systems that don't have anything to do with what we hear. So, for example, because a piece has a motive in measure 245 that's the same as the one in measure 6, that in itself says nothing about whether the event will be noticed by even the most careful listener. Motivic associations in themselves don't guarantee salience. Just because someone sees a connection does not automatically mean that anybody will notice it while listening. However, if the composer really wants us to notice the connection, it must be made more salient, for example, with one of the techniques mentioned above. Always check with your hearing before drawing important conclusions about what stands out in your music.